Good evening, everyone. My name is Kamalini Ramdas, and I'm faculty advisor for NUS Arts Festival, brought to you by NUS Center for the Arts. This year, our festival theme is A Question of Time. It is indeed a relevant theme given how many of us are currently experiencing time and space during a pandemic. Thank you for joining us for Critical Conversations. This is session 3, the final installation of 3 critical conversation sessions, where I invite 2 guests to chat about a topic relating to the festival theme. Critical Conversations marks the start of festival season, and it is our hope that these discussions will inspire you to attend some of the events we have planned for this year's festival. Our topic for discussion is telling our stories, and my 2 guests today are writer, director, producer, artist, film scholar, and educator Sarah-Tabea Sammel, and Sherman Ong, filmmaker, photographer, and visual artist. Both of our guests have been invited to speak for 10 minutes today and to share with us about how time and space are inflected in the ways they tell their stories through the medium of film and photography. Today, Sarah-Tabea will start us off, but before she does, I'd like to read a little bit of her bio for you. Sarah-Tabea pursues projects through practice as research and across video, photography, and writing. She's the founder of a Singapore-based production house as social enterprise with an inclusive capacity building program using storytelling as a communication and empathy tool. So I've visited Sarah-Tabea's website. It's beautiful, right? So we're going to share that link with you soon so you can see some of her work. It's very, very slick and very nice. Okay, so I'm inviting you guys to go check that out. That's the beauty of online, right? You get to have multiple windows open at the same time, right? So please do check out her website. Her artworks ask us to reflect about the tactile relationships between humans and nature, and their shared human experiences that cut across, right, our lives, right, to make us like think about how we coexist as beings. Okay, so I think I saw the black and white photographs, and you can see, I think some of that is your virtual background right now, if I am correct, right? So it's really quite beautiful, right? So Sarah, I'm going to invite you to share with our guests, our audience today. So you can take it away right now, and you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm checking my audio levels right now, and I think I can be confident that everybody can hear and see me without any difficulties. Getting a signal from the floor that there is a case should anybody have any technical issues. As we've all practiced so much by now, please let our panel know. Also, should anybody have any questions about whatever related that I'm talking about, I'm sure you can make use of the question instructions that were previously shared, and I'll do my best to answer questions later. Thank you very much to the NUS Art Fest for the kind invitation. It's indeed a pleasure to join here in the capacity of wearing many hats, as mentioned, and particularly concerned with temporal dimension as one of the many layers to our shared human experience of existence. I would like to talk about two of my projects today. The first project is an art film, so I'm now screen sharing with you. You will find the same information via the link that the panel kindly shared in the chat. So I would like to start by speaking about the project Ariel. Ariel is my most recent art project. It's a short film as artwork, and it's related to something that is extremely close to anything in my practice, really. That's kind of a little bit of a reoccurring thing, and that is a phenomenological approach to being in the world and to shared experiences. What that means is that we are considering what it means to be human through the lens of our senses. We have two hands, so we can touch the table that we sit at. We have 2 feet, so this is how we dance and jump and walk, or whatever forms of transport that we're having. We can sit down, we can sit in chairs, we can roll around in chairs, we can lie down, whatever it is, we're having sensual experiences. That is an entire school of philosophical thought that I feel very influenced by with a lot of my works. Ariel is looking at aerial acrobatic dance. It's an art film that is asking about the relationships temporally and spatially between aerial acrobatic performers and what we can call the operators, different types of aerial acrobatic equipment that is being used in performances. And I would like to share with you the teaser for the film. The full film is not yet released. And from experience, Zoom sometimes, the platform we are currently talking on, tends to identify soundscapes as noise and then drops the sound. I have tech checked this. It's only about 40 seconds. I'm going to show to you. In case audio drops, I hope you will have the time to revisit the website in your own time, and I will screen share with you now. So this is a teaser for Ariel. Ariel has been produced in phase 2, so it was also, in the perspective as a filmmaker, quite exciting and a true collaboration. We've had a lot of people come on board and work on this, starting with the performers and to a full fiction production team with people coming together. There's a little write-up here, which I'm gonna expand on, and the behind the scenes are showing that we are having this very conceptual approach. So this film has been conceptualized for black and white. It's a monochrome workflow, which is something that has been a focus of my work in the last year. The photography project I'm going to speak about has also got a monochrome focus. And one aspect that I find in that is that conceptualizing colors for monochrome workflow is very interesting for me. Some of you might know there's something that we can call luminosity values when it comes to colors. So how light is something? What kind of shade has a color got? There are various ways to express that, but you never just desaturate an image, because that just means you're dropping all of the information, and whatever processing item software you're using, that's going, oh, right, so all my information are gone, what's happening now? So that's not quite the perfect way to do it in a lot of situations. So we have been planning Ariel specifically for a monochrome workflow all the way through down even to costumes. And as you can see, we are applying a color triad, which means three opposite sitting colors for an advancement and enhancement of the monochrome workflow. And story-wise, Ariel is following a young woman who is magically somehow a bit Alice in Wonderland, like coming across these feathers symbolically for a new experience, and entering the Ariel studio, and then they are imagining herself as a performer, which is a bit of a dream sequence, which we've also approached with a different color scheme. And I can share with you some of the stills that are from the final film that are quite a good overview for what I just described. So for me, what's really interesting is this idea of how we exist in the world. How do you hold yourself in the world? What does it mean to take ownership of your own biography? I'm originally from Germany. I've been living and practicing and working around the world, and I've been based in Singapore for several years now. And the idea that you are negotiating your space and your time in a particular place always relates back to negotiating yourself as a person. You take yourself wherever you go in the world, and also connecting with people. So here, particularly asking about what it means to coexist in the space with the operator that is both carrying the acrobatic artist, but also being operated by that artist at the same time, while posing a challenge, while posing an outlet for art, and self-expression was at the forefront. And so this approach to monochrome workflows was something that I felt helped us negotiate the equality of spatial dimensions and of relationships in this phenomenological sense. Whereas in the dream sequence, we're just preserving a tiny little bit of color. It's a very particular workflow that I've applied, color grading this with a multi-layer approach to having a full color grading workflow, which I'm then sieving through a layering technique with a monochrome color grading workflow in a particular way to layer these images and have a see-through effect with the different layers to achieve this particular sort of semi-colored balance while preserving a correct workflow. That is something that has been influencing my work over the last year, and continuing from there, what it means to hold yourself in the world. The other project that I would like to point to is about the other important pillar in my work and in my Southeast Asian practice, which is environmentalism and human nature relationships. And the Tree Project is a monochrome photography series that has been partnered people from the cultural and social sector with a focus on that, and other artists and art practitioners with particular trees under three subject pillars of ideas of the tropics, native landscapes, and primary forest, and thereby looking at human nature relationships matching the tree and the person based on age. So the initial idea was what happens when you put a 400-year-old tree next to a 40-year-old woman, but also based on personality. So this has been a collaboration with NParks and with Fujifilm. And the write-ups are contextualizing these people, whereas with the monochromatic spacing here, I particularly wanted to generate an overview of two beings existing in the same plane, which is making the temporal relationship between them even more stunning. So this is one of the oldest trees in the Botanic Gardens, together with a 70-year-old woman. And here is a jackfruit tree that I grew from seeds for the project, together with a 1.5-year-old daughter of one of my friends. And the idea here is to talk about human nature relationships in the sense that we are living on a green planet, and that we are truly coexisting and our experiences of what it means to exist in the world over time and in a shared space can be quite different. So this picture in particular is a good example for that, which some people might point out looks as if it's layered and as if it's a cut and paste of different elements in the image, but it is indeed one single image and not processed with a very complex workflow. This is basically done in Lightroom. So I haven't done any crazy layering, copy pasting or whatever. Every bit of information that is in this image has been shot. This is in-camera information processed with this particular workflow in mind. I think the presentation 10 minutes are up. I look forward to expanding on that with the following conversation, but I'm even more excited about Sherman's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah-Tabea. So do remember, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar, and you can start typing in your questions. Next up is Sherman Ong. Okay, Sherman's practice centers largely on the human condition and our relationships with others within the larger milieu. He's a founding member of 13 Little Pictures, a film collective based in Singapore. He also serves on the committee of the Singapore International Photography Festival, as an educator at schools and universities, and was an associate artist of the Substation. He has premiered works at the Venice, Singapore, and Jakarta Art Biennales, Fukuoka and Asia Pacific Triennale, Mori Art Museum Tokyo, Tate Modern, Centre Pompidou Paris, Rotterdam International Film Festival, Singapore Art Museum, and more. So we're really honored to have you here with us, Sherman. And your 10 minutes starts now. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Kamalini, and welcome everyone for coming to this event. I guess I will start with the holding slide, and more specific to the theme of this particular presentation about telling our stories. For me, I'm from Malacca, and then I had my education in Singapore for my secondary education and my junior college and my tertiary education in Singapore. But what was fascinating, I wanted to bring, especially like Singapore as a country has, I mean, how do we understand Singapore? I mean, in order to, and for me, I always felt that you cannot fully understand Singapore without looking at Malaysia. And that has always been my starting point. And it's also partly from my personal experience. If you can see in the holding the slide in front of you, my maternal ancestor is Tan Kim Seng. And prior to moving to Singapore, he moved to Singapore in the 1820s after the British founded Singapore in 1819. And if you see, if you are familiar with Malacca, you can see this is an old photograph of the Malacca, the Red Square of Malacca. And you see the clock tower, and then you see there's a bridge. So that's the Tan Kim Seng Bridge, the original Tan Kim Seng Bridge before they demolished and then they rebuilt in during the Second World War. And then the clock tower is known as the Beng Sui Clock Tower. And in Singapore, so what happens is that the British encouraged a large group of business people and traders to, when British founded Singapore, they encouraged this group of people to help them to develop Singapore. And it was also curious that what kind of stories do we tell, or what kind of stories do we find? And from my research, there was and it was also interesting that there was a tipping point at around, this is from my historian friend, he said that at around 1840 is where the immigrants have already outnumbered the natives of Singapore. So there was like, okay, probably like 1819, and then by the time you reach 1840. So what this whole process, you could look at it as the, in my case, I think we could look at it as the Nanyang experience. The Nanyang experience would be a civilizational process. The larger part of the Nanyang experience will be a civilizational process that has taken place across centuries. But in particular, the Nanyang experience in relation to Singapore and Malaya would be from the 1800s to the early 20th century, the late. And for British Malaya, it was from for British Malaya, when Britain had control over British Malaya, during 1874 to 1919, that was when there's a huge mass migration of Chinese that came into this part of the region. So what was interesting is that like Tan Kim Seng was not part of that wave. He was much earlier. So he was already there in a prior wave from the Dutch period of Malacca. So like Tan Kim Seng to me is like 7 generations, and Tan Kim Seng is already 3rd generation Peranakan in Malacca. So for me, growing up, I always had relatives on both sides of the causeway. And in fact, my grandfather moved from Malacca to Singapore in the 50s. And then when Singapore was got her independence, he became Singaporean. And he had a second family in Singapore. And my grandmother and my mom was from the first family. So for me, going to Singapore at that point in time was always like visiting another city. And for me, it's like, I can't really tell you that. I mean, to borrow a paraphrase from Gertrude Stein, I would say that Singapore is my city and Malaysia is my country. Because I draw influences and I draw parallels from these two places. And again, in the other component of the story that I would like to talk about is also about how these migrants fit into, and this has become the sort of like the crux. I mean, this kind of experience has become the crux for me to expand into my body of work as an artist, as a visual artist. So now I would like to share with you. I mean, if you like to know more about Tan Kim Seng, you can just Google, and then you can see that in Singapore there's Kim Seng Road, and there's Jiak Kim Street, where the old Zouk was, Jiak Kim Street, and then you can also look at Beng Sui Place. So Kim Seng had his eldest son is Tan Beng Sui, and then Tan Beng Sui built the clock tower in Malacca, and then they were also very prominent. And then the most prominent one is Tan Jiak Kim, which is the eldest grandson and the eldest son of Tan Beng Sui. So, and of course, our ex-president Tony Tan also came from a different branch of Tan Jiak Kim. So I would like to show you a clip of flooding in the time of drought. This is a trailer of a diptych work which I made for the Singapore Biennale, and that would actually contextualize my body of work in relation to about identity and diaspora and a sense of home. Yeah.
Tiap pagi, saya berjalan kaki ke bus interchange. Jika antrian bus sepi, saya bisa memilih tempat duduk yang strategis, di mana saya bisa melakukan people watching yang discontinue dan agak invincible. Perilaku ini sebenarnya mengganggu bagi orang lain. Siapa yang suka diam-diam diamati makhluk lain? Tapi ini jadi kebiasaan. Saya biasa melihat sesuatu yang konstan di Singapura. Wajah muram. Apa sebab seseorang berwajah muram di pagi yang segar? Saya pernah bertanya kepada seorang kawan yang energik dan ceria. Are you happy here? Jawabannya ekspres. No. Apa pasal? Ia lalu mendadak muram dan berjalan gontai. Semua perlu uang. Bayar ini, bayar itu, sedangkan gaji kecil. Jika memang demikian, life barangkali memang sucks. Iya, hidup itu menghisap seperti lintah. Tapi apakah kita dalam hidup? Kemudian, siapakah lintah itu? Seperti mengejar ekor sendiri. Setiap pagi saya naik bus, lewat pintu yang terbuka otomatis dan bunyi tap, kartu bus yang ditempel. Wajah murah masuk berurutan. Inilah Singapura, jangan heran.
Okay. So what I would like to talk about is actually Singapore's position in the region. And since historical times, Singapore has already been fulfilling a role of becoming a hub and a city for the region. And especially now in the modern times, Singapore is actually a city for Indonesia, it's a city for Philippines. And Singapore's role from the period, it sits almost right in the center of what we would call the Nusantara or the Malay world. And the Malay world, the Nusantara is a concept that first came up during the Majapahit Empire. And it roughly stretches between the south of Thailand, south of Philippines, and it covers the Singapore, Malaya, Brunei, and the Indonesian archipelago. So again, what we see here is this kind of story, what it means. And the early inhabitants that came, you realize that like the Peranakans, they actually spoke the language of the neighbors. They spoke the language of the majority. And I don't know whether that is still the case in the present day Singapore. Like, do we really speak the language of our neighbors? Yeah, I mean, and I think I would like to show another clip, and then we will end there, and then we'll take the Q&A. So basically, it's about, yeah. Can we play the Xiaoqing? Yes. This is from my Nusantara series, and I'll just play like about a minute.
没什么好说的。我每天不就这样？我是1997年来的，那个时候好多人都要出国，后来我也很想看一看，所以我就存了一笔钱，和朋友来到这里。其实来到新加坡以后，我觉得。突然我觉得外面的世界好精彩，看见那么多高楼大厦，什么都很新，所以当时我就觉得怎么说，我觉得自己还很年轻，所以就把中国工作辞掉了。
Okay. So those who want to continue watching, you can find the link in the chat, and then you can watch the entire film. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks to both our panelists, right? So I remind the audience joining us to please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. But I'm going to start us off, right, by having both Sarah-Tabea and Sherman reflect a little bit on their presentations, right? So the first question I have is, through your photographs and film, you invite us to think about consciousness as temporal and spatial, right? So what inspired you to choose nature for Sarah-Tabea, right? And the idea of Southeast Asia or the region for Sherman, right? To begin that conversation about the relationship between consciousness, time, and space, or if we want to say the individual time and space, right? So what does using nature, right, as the trope or the idea of the region, right? What does that allow us to do if we want to, to make that connection between people, right, and their interactions with time and space? So maybe I can invite Sarah-Tabea to start us off first, and then have Sherman to share.
Okay.
Thank you. For me, well, there are several dimensions to that, but in the most straightforward way, if we would have a climate change catastrophe in Southeast Asia, the Mekong Delta alone could see 60 million climate refugees. And it is indeed linked to this region if weather in North America remains stable or not in certain ways or another, right? It's a very long and scientific conversation we can have, but in a very roundabout and purposefully slightly polemic way, it is absolutely vital that we talk about human nature relationships at the equator, and particularly in the Southeast Asian region. A lot of my feelings towards Singapore and its history are obviously influenced both by historical trajectory that is researchable for me, but also by my experience in the very presence here. And it seems for me to be impossible to live here and not address this space as something that we are guests in, right, as standing in. The tree project actually had a phase 2 planned for Northern Europe, which would then also be able to address colonialization and sea trade, but was put on hold, obviously, because of the pandemic. But yeah, so addressing that from a climate change perspective is extremely urgent to me. The other idea relates to our concept of space and what that means, that we live in spaces and places that are declared nation states, that are declared community, but then we grow up in societies and are just asked to make sense of being a human being among other human beings. So for me, it's also very linked about our day-to-day experiences, which are global and would apply to any place for me that I would be living in, to ask how are we actually making sense of our shared experiences right here, right now. And the age dimension for me with trees as some of the oldest living beings around us is what was quite an obvious choice. And for me, I think we live on a green planet, not on a blue planet, also relating to the history of how old algae are, and I can probably geek on about that for a little while. But yeah.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I really want to say that your photographs really helped me to understand that better, because, the scale, the way you scale, there's something very intimate, right? So there's a small person next to a really huge tree. And, when I look at the images, I'm thinking about how long it took the tree to get there, what kind of relationship I have with the tree, right? And yet the distance, right? The 400 years and the person standing there seems really intimate because of the way you've shot the image, right? So it's really wonderful. So thank you for that. The images, they really made me think about that. For Sherman, I think the intimate is also quite important to you, right? So when you're talking about the region, right, at some level you're also trying to bring your own personal story into it. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about what does this regional time mean for you? On the one hand, it is about the politics and the history of this place we call Southeast Asia, but for you, it's also about your own personal history, right?
Yes.
So how does bringing these two together help you to think through time more provocatively or more in different ways?
I think the region, I would like to go back to the word Nusantara. And Nusantara, Nusa means island, and Antara means in between. So what is in between the islands? They are actually the waterways. And these waterways, they are the conduits, and these waterways facilitate trade. And with trade, you have, they bring together the value system. They bring, of course, your discrimination. They bring the customs, the rituals, the myths, legends. And this region is unique because it sits in between the two giants, big civilization, all like India and China. And of course, Southeast Asia is a lot more influenced by the Indian tradition, because the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they form the crux of the early foundation of literature of the region. And of course, then you have the maritime and continental Southeast Asia. What was also interesting was that it is also a personal thing, because my work tends to like almost walking on the footsteps of my ancestors. Yeah, because as I was growing up, we were known as, oh, these are the Chinese who are not Chinese. So what does it mean is that these are the Chinese who are not Chinese? And what does it mean eventually if you extrapolate that to mean, what does it mean like these are the Malays who are not Malays? And these are the Indians who are not Indians. So eventually they become Singaporeans, I think. They have to leave behind something. And which is why the early Chinese knew that if they come into this territory, they need to speak the language of the neighbors or the language of this region in order to thrive. But I think now in the present day, we tend to pull ourselves into silos again. And I think the CMIO categorization is, for me, is kind of problematic, because it defeats the ability to form the Singapore identity or the Malaysian identity. And that's why I find this region is so unique, because it was a time when these kinds of classification were not so obvious, and there's a lot of hybridity and there's a lot of mixing. And I think like the Peranakan culture is a showcase where the men would marry the women of the region, primarily because when they first traveled out of China, the women, you can't have women leaving China at that time. Only maybe the very rich Chinese would be able to bring their women with them. Yeah, and this would be during the 12th century, the 11th century, the 10th century. And then of course there's the second wave is when during British Malaya, and when Britain founded Singapore. That is a different wave of migration, and that part of the migration is where the women folk could come with the men. So you have the two separate experience, and these two separate experience create a different kind of like cultural pool. Yeah, so for me, it's like, it's personal, because I essentially am just taking my ancestors, tracing my ancestors' footsteps. But at the same time, I'm also trying to understand myself. What does it mean to be Chinese who are not Chinese?
Yeah. I think that's really important. So like, I think one thing that I take away from what you're saying here is that this notion that we start with the personal, but we also want to extend that beyond just the personal to make connections to sort of historically what is taking place, right? So when we ask the question, what is Southeast Asia, or who is Southeast Asia, right? And we start, like you starting from your personal narratives, but then thinking about it through Nusantara, right? Or through Nanyang, and what that means to be Sherman Ong today in Singapore and / KL, right? But I think,
Maybe can I add one thing?
Yeah.
And it's also the other point of view of why I look at the Nusantara as a whole is because as an artist, I started my artistic practice in Singapore. But at the same time, I was also looking at what is Singapore's cachet. And Singapore's cachet is limited if you just look at Singapore on its borders, the borders of Singapore alone. But Singapore's cachet is a lot, it goes beyond her borders. And if you look beyond the borders, and as an artist who talks about a region like this, then I can be untouchable. I can stand on a global stage. Because if I just do something that is of the Chinese language or the Malay language, then we'll be overshadowed by Indonesia, we'll be overshadowed by Taiwan, we'll be overshadowed by China. But if you pull all this other disparate elements, and like for me, I move between the Chinese world and the Malay world, and that also makes me like I increase the barriers to entry from those who are from the Chinese side or the Malay side. Yeah.
So I think that definitely there's scope to think about hybridity and what starting points, right? Like when we start counting and what that allows us to say about our hybridity. But I want to move on to another question. Next, something around technique or your own practice, right? So if you think about it, for both of you, right, time, is something that we can sort of objectively count and enumerate, but it's also emotionally experienced or embodied, right? So, for example, in Ariel, right, there is a kind of suspension, right, of time standing still, but also the use of all these, the equipment and the spinning, right, that also gives us a sensation of time moving very quickly, right? But all within a short, like that instant. So there's so many different layers of time taking place in the one shot or the one visual, right? So I want you to reflect a little bit on your technique, like as a filmmaker, right? What is it that you're thinking through? What is your process, when you're trying to capture this multi-layered understanding of time and temporality? So maybe Sarah-Tabea, if you can start off, maybe speaking to Ariel, if you like, or the tree project, either one.
Thank you. Yeah, for Ariel specifically, I knew that there would be a process of filming pretty much the entire thing in slow motion, and then having speed up effects later in the edit, because we are addressing gravity, and that goes really quickly. Even a dropping feather is falling surprisingly fast when you're realizing on set that you need to allocate your grip as a feather wrangler, because somebody has to stand there and keep dropping the feather while everybody's going, oh dear, that we get that. So an interesting layer of time for the production was definitely that we had to factor in additional time to really view all the stuff that we had shot. And so Ariel is influenced also by my own practice, because I actually do that. I actually practice in Ariel acrobatics. So there was a sense for me that I wanted to address questions that for me became relevant as I myself have been in the air, and what it means to work with the operators, and how I would be able to address it for the audience who is not having that feeling. So tactility, how can we address that? And one technique that I applied for that was to quite strategically layer where we place whom in the space, while maintaining social distancing, which is always a fun fact at the moment. But while doing that, we were able to also layer attention and focus points. And what's maybe interesting for audiences is that it has to be a one-shot wonder, because you can only ask each performer to go on 100% once, and then you need to give them a proper break. Because you can basically imagine that the moment you start doing anything on the operator, you're starting a sprint. So for how long can you effectively sprint really, really well? Well, these people are extreme professionals, so they can do that for 3 to 5 minutes. But we were really structuring the shoot based on when do we ask which performer to give 100%, and when is which performer where in the background, where we can ask them to be going a bit less. And the moment we said this is now 100% was also the moment where we had almost like a camera crew choreography, because we shot largely handheld, and the cinematography department had to go in and out in relationship with the performer. So we had to do a lot of dry rehearsals from the ground in order to preserve these 100%. So I think that all of these layers of time are now visible in the final outcome, which I'm very thankful for, but which was really a very experimental approach during production as well, with, to be honest, safety as a foremost concern, and working backwards from there.
Thanks so much. In fact, I was going to ask you, like, have you actually done this? Like, because I was trying to imagine, like, how would it be to film something like this and not have it done yourself? So I'm glad that you did share that with the audience, that you actually are a practitioner in some sense, that you actually have done this before. So I think it must be really quite cool then, right?
Yeah, so I'm constantly, so this is one of the most influential things from my practice at the moment, that I do this. So yeah, that from there were most of the questions that I was addressing in that piece, which would otherwise probably have to needed an acrobatic advisor as a dolmetcher, because language becomes a very important pointer in the process then.
Thanks so much, Sarah-Tabea. Sherman, I wonder if you could share a little bit about the technique, right? So for example, in Xiaoqing, right, the story is about a new immigrant, I guess, right, in Singapore, right? And yet it is part of the Nusantara series, right? So how do you make that connection between new immigrant experiences and the connection to the past sort of imagination of Southeast Asia, right? So what is it that you want your audience to reflect on, and how do you do it in the film? If you can sort of give us an idea, as you know, from that perspective as the filmmaker. Sherman, you need to unmute. Yeah.
Hello. Yep.
Yeah. Great.
So if you look at the Xiaoqing film, I mean, for the rest, they can watch the entire film. But if you realize that in that film, there's only 3 cuts, right? And then the first 2 cuts, and then there's a long monologue without cut. And with that, I wanted to actually not cut as a way to have a temporal connection. That was one of my reasons. And it's because we are so used to watch TV. And I coming from a TV background. I cut my teeth in television. And it's always the executive producer will always say, after every 3 seconds, you need to have a cut. Every 5 seconds, you need to have a cut. You say, or else the audience will change the channel. So for me, it's very frustrating. You know, it's like because there are certain nuances within the take. So for me, this was also a challenge to actually elongate, to have that time, and then to have that kind of temporal connection that is almost. She spoke for about, I think, 12 minutes. But actually, the entire thing was scripted, but she delivers it almost like a flow of. It's like almost peeling an onion. You go layer by layer. So that was one time. And then the other one that I want to talk about is actually, there's 3 aspects of time when you watch the film Xiaoqing. One is that what you see on the screen is actually not what you will see. You know, like what you see on the screen is just this woman on the sitting on a chair and talking. But what it conjures up is actually this screen, is this mental image, and this invisible screen that will only appear when the audience sits in front and watch the film. So only when there's the audience and the film, and that interaction is like A plus B, then C will appear. And that C only appears in that mental space. And that is a separate time. And again, also, so I mean, that is the other aspect. And another point is that Xiaoqing is addressing something that is very cyclical. She, I think, and in fact, I wrote her script based on reports. There was this about these new Chinese ladies, they were known as the Dragon Ladies or the Xiaolong Nui, who were home wreckers, and they will go after the Singapore men and cheat them of their money and blah, 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 blah. But I also wanted to give, and then there was this resentment of this new group of this later wave of Chinese. But if you know the history, the Peranakans were actually resentful of the wave, the second wave of Chinese, which is now the 3rd or 4th generation Singaporeans. The Peranakans were resentful of them because they were seen as, these are the Chinaga, these are the, because these are the group that came later, these are the group that the later wave of Chinese had to find a space for them to exist economically. And one of the later waves would be like the Hainanese. They either work for the British or they work for Peranakan families. And so I have my eldest, like my elder auntie who said, you cannot marry the Hainanese. They are from the servant class. So that's why when I was looking at the resentment of the average Singaporean towards this group of new Chinese immigrants, I said, then the Peranakans were also resentful of you guys, right? You know, so it's a cyclical thing that will happen, And then eventually when we have these Chinese who eventually become Singaporean, and they will also be resentful of the later Chinese that come. It's the same with the British experience in Jamaica. When you have the British Jamaicans, they try to fit into when they try to go into London and then try to fit in. So this thing is never ending. If you know history, then you understand. If not, then you think that, oh, it's a phenomenon, it's a new phenomenon of the dragon ladies. But it's not. The Peranakans were doing it to your current third or fourth generation Singaporeans.
Thanks so much, Sherman.
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask a question from the audience here, right? And it's taking us from the past to the present, right? So the question is, I would like to ask the panelists how their work has been affected by COVID, perhaps in terms of shared morality and shared space, right? So I guess the person who asked the question wants you to reflect on what COVID has done to your practice, right? How you do your work. Yeah. So maybe we can start with Sarah-Tabea and then Sherman after that.
Okay.
Yeah, for us, it's a lot of very straightforward rule applying, health and safety protocols, particularly when we operate with full crews, which was the case with Ariel, so that operated under a large crew license, even though it was not a large crew, but we were already in that sector. For the tree project, there was this really awkward pause because my research had ended just at the end of 2019. It was a half-year research phase across 2 countries. And then I started production just at the beginning of 2020, was happily going along. And then we came to February. And then there was this really awkward time of, and now what? And as it emerged that it did become again possible to go out in phase 2, there was a lot of tentativeness involved, going round. And in this instance, it was only me doing the entire production. So everything's with natural light, and which was in places very challenging. But yeah, it was a lot about masking, unmasking, but it opened up very interesting conversations with my subjects in the tree project, because you all of a sudden started to talk about not just what do we have in common with nature, what do we have in common with our values regarding climate change, but actually what kind of society do we want to be, global society, not just Singapore, not just circle of acquaintances, but globally. We are in Singapore, your parents are sitting in Malaysia, your parents are sitting in Germany, your family is sitting in the UK, your entire family is sitting in Singapore, and everybody decided to isolate together so that nobody would be left behind. What does that mean? What does that do to us globally? And all of a sudden there was this extra layer that we started to talk about, more or less literally sitting under a tree. And that was quite influential for the last production stretch that I was on.
Thanks so much. What about you, Sherman?
I was actually thinking about what's the end point of art making, whether this endeavor is a wasteful endeavor, or whether, I mean, like the survey says, like art making could be one of the non-essential things, or whether there is a spiritual, spiritual, yeah, I mean, whether there is a spiritual component to art making. Yeah, so I mean, I've shared a link of to everyone, and that is actually a much longer interview, not like a chat session. And I think at the end of the day, I was using the COVID situation lockdown to really delve into actually, where do we go with art making? What's the end point of art making? Is it only for us to be? Is it only for the for the ego of the artist, or is it there to serve a larger purpose? And I think that for me is like, if it's only there, then it's a wasteful endeavor. Then you might as well don't make art, because art has a purpose, and art has a spiritual component that is there to enhance the well-being of humans. And I think that is something that most of us tend to overlook.
Thanks so much, Sherman. So I've been given the signal that we're running out of time. I have another question that I really want to ask. I'm just going to read it out. You don't have to answer it, but I really think it's important, like for both of you, what you're talking about, right? It's making me think about the politics of remembering, right? And I think this is really like, how do we start to think about what it is we remember, right? Do we think of starting points? Do we think of objects that intervene, whether it's a rope or a cable or a tree, that make us think about what it is we remember or yearn or long for, right? So once, so this is something that I'm still sort of trying to work through, right? And I guess both of your sort of engagements have helped me to think through some of this, and I hope that it has prompted our audience to also reflect on what the politics of remembering is for them, right? Does it mean, does it have to do with the materiality of your life, the emotional aspects about love, anger, jealousy, resentment, right? These are some of the things that some of the sort of pathways that you invite us to sort of explore when we think about time and also space, of course, right? So I want to thank you both for really doing such a great job sharing with us your practice, your work, and I really invite everyone to do more by go and visit those websites and definitely keep chatting about this. Thank you so much to both Sherman and Sarah-Tabea for joining us today again. And for those of you who are joining us for Critical Conversations, please do remember to keep a lookout for other events such as Musings on Time, right, which is a provocation by faculty members at the Communications and New Media department, right, through their reflections on time in relation to our program this year for this year's festival. So that's one thing you might want to go and take a look at. The second thing also is to please do give us your feedback for today's session. So do click that QR code there to give us your feedback for today's session. And I'd also like to finally invite you to please join us at the festival. So you can take part by looking for tickets online. You can join us online for some of these sessions, or there are some face-to-face sessions as well, but those are ticketed, so you'll need to check on their availability. The festival opens on 19th of March, and we hope that you will join us. As Sherman says, art is spiritual. So for all of you who are sort of, yearning for something more during this specific time of COVID, maybe it's time to join us at the Arts Festival this year. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.
Ciao,
Bye.
ciao. Okay.